The Bourbon dynasty demanded a perfect, straight prince. But Luis Fernando was a gay man trapped in a Catholic marble prison. To survive, he fled to Paris, trading his sacred royal blood for the unapologetic freedom of the queer underworld. The sheer magnitude of this rebellion was born from a suffocating reality. In the Madrid of 1888, Luis Fernando María Zacarías de Orleans y Bourbon was not merely an heir, he was the distillation of centuries of European power. His father was a Spanish infante, and his mother was the famously rebellious Infanta Eulalia of Spain, parents who were notoriously distant, leaving the boy to the sterile, unfeeling machinery of the court, rather than offering any genuine familial warmth or protection. His bloodline was a dense, intertwined tapestry of the continent's most formidable monarchs, and his first cousin was King Alfonso XIII of Spain. From the moment he drew his first breath, Luis Fernando's life belonged exclusively to the crown, reduced to a meticulously choreographed performance, dictated by the rigid, unyielding protocols of the Spanish court. At the turn of the 20th century, the Bourbon dynasty was an institution steeped in aggressive conservatism and strict adherence to the Catholic faith. It was an environment that demanded absolute conformity. Princes of the blood were expected to be martial, stoic, and perfectly aligned with the heterosexual imperatives required to secure lineages and forge diplomatic alliances through marriage. Every gesture, every spoken word, and every public appearance was heavily scrutinized by a vast machinery of courtiers, advisors, and the public eye. For a young man harboring an identity that fundamentally contradicted everything his family stood for, the royal palaces of Madrid served as high-security prisons constructed of marble and obligation. Early accounts describe the young Infante as a creature of striking, almost fragile beauty. He was slight of build, possessing an elegance that leaned far more toward the artistic than the militaristic. Observers frequently noted his large, melancholic eyes and hands so beautifully formed they seemed lifted from a Renaissance painting. In his youth, he played the part required of him perfectly. He was charming, possessed a razor-sharp wit, and quickly became a darling of the aristocratic salons. He wore the heavy military uniforms laden with medals, stood rigidly at attention during state ceremonies, and smiled for the portraits that would hang in the halls of power. But beneath this immaculate surface, an immense psychological pressure cooker was building. Luis Fernando was intensely aware that his desires, his fundamental nature, were considered not merely inappropriate, but actively monstrous by the society that worshipped him. He was a homosexual man born into the epicenter of a fiercely traditional Catholic monarchy. The friction between the role he was forced to inhabit and the truth of his own flesh was unsustainable. He could not merely exist. He was forced to actively suppress his very essence every single day. This relentless internal war required an escape valve, a place where the crushing gravity of the Bourbon name could not reach him. That escape valve was Paris. Following the catastrophic devastation of the First World War, the French capital underwent a violent, euphoric cultural explosion. The Année Folle, the crazy years, transformed the city into a global epicenter of hedonism, artistic revolution, and sexual liberation. The old social orders had been fractured by the trenches, and in their place arose a desperate, frantic desire to consume life entirely. Paris was a city breathing in double time, fueled by jazz, avant-garde art, and a sudden profound dismantling of Victorian morality. For a wealthy, deeply repressed Spanish prince, Paris offered far more than a destination. It was sheer salvation. It offered a sprawling, chaotic playground entirely devoid of the suffocating rules of Madrid. When Luis Fernando initially relocated to France, he maintained a semblance of his former life. He utilized his royal pedigree to gain immediate access to the most exclusive and refined drawing rooms of Parisian high society. He was still the king's cousin, a prized guest who brought a sheen of old-world majesty to any gathering. However, the cracks in his aristocratic facade began to show almost immediately. The acute observations of Elizabeth de Gramont, the Duchess of Clermont-Tonnerre, provide a chillingly precise look into this transitional period of his life. A sharp-eyed chronicler of Parisian society who herself lived a relatively open life as a lesbian, she saw right through the Infante's charming veneer. In her memoirs, she documented the erratic, deeply troubled nature of his existence. She observed him moving seamlessly but frantically between vastly different worlds. One evening, he would be holding court in a glittering salon, the epitome of royal grace. The next, he would vanish entirely into the city's most dangerous and degraded slums. She painted a portrait of a man torn apart by his own duality, describing how he would wander the lowest dens of the city, only to later collapse in tears, begging the aristocratic kind ladies for comfort like a terrified, abandoned child. This was not the behavior of a man simply indulging in a bit of youthful rebellion. This was a man frantically searching for an anchor in a world he was rapidly spiraling out of control within. The salons of the elite could not provide the absolute sensory oblivion he craved. He needed a place where the name Bourbon meant nothing, where he could be worshipped not for his ancestors, but for his immediate, visceral presence. Inevitably, Luis Fernando abandoned the glittering heights of polite society and plunged headfirst into the Parisian underbelly. By the early 1920s, he had entirely relocated his spiritual and physical existence to the bouge, the smoky, illicit dives of Montmartre and Pigalle. This was a shadowy, transient world populated by petty criminals, struggling bohemian artists, sailors on shore leave desperate for a quick influx of cash, and a vast network of young male prostitutes. Here, the Infante of Spain systematically shed his royal skin. He swept into this queer subculture with the clear intention to conquer it. He began to leverage his massive royal allowance, funds explicitly intended to maintain a dignified aristocratic household, to finance an alternate reality where he was the absolute monarch. He threw endless multi-day parties characterized by a torrential flow of expensive champagne and, increasingly, heavy narcotics. Opium was the fashionable vice of the era, an exotic import from colonial Indochina, consumed in plush, velvet-draped rooms. But the slow, lethargic high of opium was not enough to numb the acute pain of his divided life. Luis Fernando rapidly escalated to harder, more destructive substances, developing crippling addictions to morphine and cocaine. These drugs provided a frantic, unyielding energy that perfectly mirrored the chaos of his new life. His physical appearance underwent a radical and shocking transformation. The stiff masculine military uniforms of his youth were discarded entirely. He began to experiment wildly and publicly with cross-dressing and heavy theatrical makeup. He painted his face with thick layers of rouge and circled his eyes with dark kohl, creating a ghostly, spectral visage. He draped himself in exquisite women's jewelry, the glittering diamonds creating a grotesque contrast with eyes that were permanently glazed over and deadened by narcotics. In the dim light of the underground clubs, surrounded by a constantly shifting retinue of rough young men whose affection and silence he purchased outright, he finally found his throne. He was the center of attention, a tragic, fascinating spectacle that drew the denizens of the night to him like moths to a flame. The whispers began in the dark corners of the clubs, spreading rapidly through the network of the Parisian underbelly. They gave him nicknames that were equal parts mocking and reverent, titles he embraced with a defiant, self-destructive pride. He was no longer His Royal Highness. He was the King of the Fags. He was the King of Sodom. He had successfully built an empire out of his own degradation, a kingdom sustained entirely by royal wealth and pharmaceutical oblivion. His reign over this illicit world was solidified by his highly public, scandalous relationship with Antonio de Vasconcelos, a remarkably handsome Portuguese nobleman. Together they stood as a walking provocation, quickly becoming the undisputed royalty of the gay demi-monde. They shared an opulent Parisian apartment that quickly devolved from a luxurious residence into a notorious site of debauchery. It became a legendary hub where the absolute highest tiers of European aristocracy collided with the absolute lowest dregs of the city's criminal underclass. They routinely hosted wild drug-fueled orgies, frequently bringing home sailors picked up at the rough docks or young men procured from the local bars. These gatherings were not discreet affairs hidden behind heavy curtains. They were loud, violent, and chaotic, frequently spilling out into the public hallways or drawing the terrified attention of neighboring residents. Luis Fernando was living a completely untenable existence, attempting to merge the absolute deference demanded by a Spanish Infante with the reckless abandon of a common criminal. He expected society to bow to his bloodline, while he actively spat on every value that bloodline represented. And across the border, in the austere halls of the royal palace in Madrid, King Alfonso XIII was watching this horrifying spectacle unfold. The Spanish monarchy was already navigating incredibly treacherous political waters, facing rising domestic unrest and the looming threat of anti-royalist sentiment. The Spanish ambassadors in Paris were locked in a constant, humiliating battle of damage control, quietly paying off the local police force, silencing terrified hoteliers, and doing everything in their power to keep the Bourbon name out of the scandal sheets. But Luis Fernando's complete lack of discretion, his absolute refusal to hide his sexuality or his addictions, made this an impossible task. The tension between the rigid Spanish court and the drug-addled prince in Paris was stretching to the breaking point. It was not a matter of if the entire structure would collapse, but when. The breaking point arrived in the autumn of 1924. The Parisian authorities, who had long remained tolerant of aristocratic eccentricities, provided they were accompanied by sufficient bribes and a thin veneer of discretion, finally lost their patience. The precise details of Luis Fernando's final transgression remained deliberately obscured, buried beneath layers of diplomatic euphemism and redacted police files. Officially, the charge leveled against him was involvement in illicit drug trafficking. To the French state, he was no longer merely a high society addict. His voracious appetite for cocaine and opium, coupled with the sheer volume of narcotics required to sustain his sprawling, multi-day orgies, had dangerously blurred the line between a wealthy consumer and a criminal distributor. But the narcotics were merely a convenient pretext. The undeniable reality was that the French government, buckling under intense, sustained diplomatic pressure from Madrid, needed an airtight excuse to rid themselves of an individual whose violently public homosexual lifestyle had become a glaring international liability. On October 10th, 1924, the hammer fell. French authorities issued a formal order of expulsion. The Infante of Spain, a man whose ancestors had literally dictated the borders of Europe, was unceremoniously handed a deportation notice and ordered to leave the country like a common undesirable vagrant. The humiliation of being escorted to the border by French police was devastating, but it was merely a prelude to the life-altering blow that was about to strike from his own homeland. In Madrid, King Alfonso XIII recognized that the moment for quiet containment and diplomatic damage control had passed. The Bourbon dynasty was navigating incredibly fragile, treacherous political terrain. Spain was grappling with severe domestic instability, deep economic anxiety, and a rapidly rising tide of anti-monarchist sentiment that would eventually culminate in the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic. Alfonso could simply not afford the toxic taint of a drug-addled, publicly homosexual cousin parading through the scandal sheets of Europe. The king understood that the gangrenous limb had to be violently amputated to save the body of the monarchy. He acted with a speed and a bureaucratic coldness that was breathtaking in its cruelty. The very next day, October 11th, 1924, a royal decree was published in the Gaceta de Madrid, the official bulletin of the Spanish state. The language of the document was entirely devoid of any familial warmth, sorrow, or regret. It was a surgical strike designed to permanently obliterate Luis Fernando's public existence. The decree stated with brutal clarity that his conduct did not permit him to worthily bear the honors and favors granted by the crown. With the stroke of a pen, Alfonso XIII stripped his cousin of all privileges, titles, and decorations. He was no longer an Infante of Spain. He was stripped of the Grand Cross of Charles III and the knighthood of Granada. His royal allowance was immediately and permanently severed, and he was banned from ever setting foot on Spanish soil again. This was an exceptionally rare and brutal maneuver in the history of European royalty. The Spanish royal family did not merely disown him, they executed him socially. They declared to the world that, for all official and legal intents and purposes, Luis Fernando was dead. One can only begin to imagine the profound psychological rupture this caused. To be raised from birth with the absolute certainty of your divine right, your inherent superiority, and your untouchable status, only to have it entirely revoked by your own blood, is a uniquely shattering experience. For a brief moment, there must have been an agonizing realization of his own utter vulnerability. He was 36 years old, suddenly stateless, financially severed from his primary source of income, and publicly branded a global pariah. But instead of retreating into quiet repentance, seeking reconciliation, or fading into obscurity, Luis Fernando weaponized his newly acquired disgrace. If he could not be a prince of Spain, he would become the absolute, uncontested ruler of his own ruination. He enthusiastically embraced the mocking titles bestowed upon him by the Parisian underworld. He leaned into the moniker Rey de las Maricas, wearing the insult as a badge of honor, a deliberate, grotesque parody of the crown that had violently rejected him. Forced out of France, he sought refuge in Lisbon, Portugal. He arrived in a city that was far more conservative, provincial, and traditional than the electric, forgiving environment of Paris. For 3 years, between 1924 and 1927, he existed in a state of chaotic, restless exile. One might expect that in such a monumental public humiliation, the loss of his home, his title, and his family would serve as a desperate wake-up call. It did exactly the opposite. Stripped of his titles, he was paradoxically liberated from the last remaining shreds of aristocratic decorum. He no longer had a family reputation to protect because he had been explicitly, legally removed from that family. His behavior in Portugal became increasingly erratic and self-destructive, culminating in a deeply bizarre and humiliating incident at the border in the Algarve in March 1926. He was apprehended by Portuguese customs officials, not for smuggling the narcotics that had become his daily lifeblood, but for attempting to cross the border heavily disguised as an Andalusian woman carrying undeclared contraband goods. It was a spectacular, almost theatrical display of self-sabotage. It was as if he were actively daring the authorities to arrest him, turning his own criminal detention into a piece of tragic performance art. The image of the former Infante of Spain, heavily made up, wearing a dress, and being aggressively detained by bewildered border guards, perfectly encapsulated the tragic absurdity of his existence. It was a desperate, flailing cry for attention from a man who had just been told by the entire world that he no longer mattered. By the late 1920s, the political climate and the memories of the French authorities had softened just enough for him to quietly slip back into France. Paris was the only city where he truly felt he belonged, the only place that understood the language of his specific despair, even if it had previously cast him out. But the landscape of his life had fundamentally altered. The endless flowing stream of Bourbon money had finally run dry. His severe, escalating addictions to morphine and cocaine demanded a constant, exorbitant influx of cash, as did the retinue of young men and the lavish, chaotic lifestyle he absolutely refused to abandon. He was rapidly approaching his 40s. The youthful, fragile beauty that had once captivated the elite salons of Paris was fading, heavily ravaged by years of relentless substance abuse and nocturnal living. The kohl around his eyes and the rouge on his cheeks could no longer hide the gaunt, hollowed-out reality of a man slowly killing himself. He was broke, increasingly isolated as old fair-weather friends abandoned him, and staring down the barrel of absolute destitution. Faced with the terrifying, entirely unfamiliar prospect of poverty, Luis Fernando was forced to pivot. He realized that while his family had legally stripped him of his titles and his homeland had locked him out, the intoxicating aura of royalty still clung to him in the eyes of the socially ambitious. The name Orleans y Bourbon still held an immense, almost magical currency, particularly among the newly wealthy foreign expatriates who violently craved the historical legitimacy that only old European blood could provide. He decided to leverage the very last asset he possessed. The former prince transformed himself into a high-stakes predator, actively hunting for a wealthy benefactor willing to finance his slow, spectacular suicide in exchange for a proximity to a throne that had already disowned him. The target of his first calculated financial strike was Mabel Gilman Corey. She was a woman who deeply understood the mechanics of transactional relationships. As a glamorous American actress who had previously married and divorced William E. Corey, the immensely wealthy president of United States Steel, she knew precisely how to purchase status. When she looked at Luis Fernando, she did not see a physically deteriorating, drug-addicted exile. She saw a crown, albeit a heavily tarnished one. To an ambitious American socialite, the prospect of attaching the title of princess to her name, even through a disgraced Bourbon, was an intoxicating prize. In 1929, they announced their engagement. For a brief moment, it appeared Luis Fernando had successfully executed his desperate survival strategy. He had found a woman rich enough to underwrite his catastrophic lifestyle and eager enough for royal proximity to overlook his towering flaws. But Luis Fernando's reality was far too toxic even for this cynical, carefully negotiated bargain. He remained utterly incapable of playing the part of a dutiful, respectable fiancé, even temporarily. His severe addiction to cocaine and morphine was not a secret, manageable vice kept behind closed doors. It was the violent, organizing principle of his entire existence. His demands for money began almost immediately, long before the ink on the engagement announcements was dry. He required thousands of francs to silence blackmailers, to pay off furious hoteliers, and to keep his vast rotating retinue of young male lovers lavishly entertained. Mabel Corey was ambitious, but she was not a fool. She possessed a ruthless pragmatism forged in the fires of American industry and high society. As she spent more time in his orbit, she was forced to confront the undeniable, grotesque reality of his daily life. She witnessed the glazed eyes, the frantic energy of the withdrawals, and the endless parade of rough trade moving in and out of his apartments. She quickly calculated that marrying Luis Fernando meant inviting a hurricane of public scandal and absolute financial ruin into her meticulously curated life. The engagement collapsed spectacularly. It was a highly public, humiliating failure that left the former Infante entirely destitute, stripped of his last defense and more desperate than he had ever been. This blinding desperation pushed him toward a target that was almost unbelievably tragic in her vulnerability. He needed a victim who was entirely blinded by the illusion of his past, someone who possessed vast wealth but lacked the cynical defensive pragmatism of Mabel Corey. He found exactly that in Marie Constance Charlotte Say. Marie Say was a living relic of a bygone era, a woman who had existed for decades in a state of unimaginable gilded privilege. Born into the colossal Say sugar empire, she was widely considered one of the wealthiest women in France. As the widow of Prince Henri Amédée de Broglie, she had spent over half a century presiding over the breathtaking Château de Chaumont-sur-Loire, a magnificent, sprawling Renaissance fortress overlooking the Loire River. She had hosted European monarchs, visiting Maharajas, and the absolute elite of the cultural world within its tapestried walls. She was a titan of the old aristocracy. But by 1930, Marie Say was 72 years old. The glittering parties that had defined her youth had faded into memory. Her husband was long dead, and she was enveloped in the deep, quiet, paralyzing loneliness that so often accompanies outliving one's own era and peers. Furthermore, she harbored a fatal, lifelong weakness for charming aristocratic men, a psychological vulnerability that Luis Fernando recognized instantly and exploited with the cold, precise calculation of a predator cornering wounded prey. He was 42 years old, 3 decades her junior, a man entirely hollowed out by hard narcotics and legally exiled by his own bloodline. Yet, beneath the heavy makeup and the drug-induced lethargy, he still possessed the residual, deeply ingrained charm of a Bourbon prince. He knew exactly how to speak, how to bow, and how to command a room when the situation demanded it. He turned the full, concentrated force of that weaponized charm upon the elderly dowager. He did not present himself to her as the king of Sodom, nor did he reveal the drug-addicted reprobate who held court in the filthy underground clubs of Montmartre. Instead, he meticulously crafted the persona of a deeply misunderstood, tragically sensitive aristocrat who had been cruelly and unjustly victimized by a rigid, unfeeling royal family. He played the part of the wounded exile to absolute perfection, presenting himself as a vulnerable man crying out for sanctuary and understanding. Marise, perhaps blinded by her crushing loneliness, or perhaps willingly deceiving herself to secure a companion for her final years, walked directly into the trap. Where the world saw a dangerous, degenerate addict, she chose to see a prince who desperately needed saving. Where she saw an opportunity to mother and protect a piece of living history, he saw a bottomless bank account attached to a woman far too old and frail to effectively police his darkest, most destructive habits. The announcement of their impending marriage sent a shock wave of absolute revulsion and horror through the remaining aristocratic salons of Europe. It was widely perceived by everyone in their social circle not as a late-in-life romance, but as a deliberate, slow-motion, financial execution. Marie's family, her lifelong friends, and her fiercely protective legal advisors fought frantically to stop the union. They staged interventions, begging her to look closely at the reality of the man she was legally binding herself to. They presented her with the undeniable documented evidence of his highly public homosexuality, his severe, life-threatening drug addiction, and his status as a royal outcast who had been explicitly disowned by King Alfonso XIII. They warned her that he would drain her empire dry, but their desperate protests only seemed to harden her resolve. She isolated herself from her advisors, choosing to believe the fiction Luis Fernando had so carefully constructed for her. On September 19, 1930, they were married in a quiet civil ceremony at a registry office in London. An event followed shortly thereafter by a religious ceremony in San Remo, Italy, on October 4th. The archival photographs from this period are profoundly unsettling to witness. Marise appears incredibly frail, her face lined with age, heavily layered in the elaborate, outdated fashions of a century that had already passed. Beside her stands Luis Fernando. He is physically bloated, his posture rigid but unnatural, his eyes carrying the unmistakable, deadened, heavy-lidded weight of a man actively consumed by narcotics. He had officially secured the bag. He was now legally entitled to the vast fortunes of the Say Sugar Empire. The very moment the vows were finalized and the legal documents signed, the financial slaughter commenced. Luis Fernando did not use his new wife's colossal fortune to quietly stabilize his life, to seek medical rehabilitation, or to provide her with the gentle, aristocratic companionship she had so desperately paid for. Instead, he used her immense wealth as a chemical accelerant, pouring high-octane gasoline on the fire of his own destruction. He immediately resumed his sprawling, chaotic existence in the Parisian underworld, his darkest impulses now backed by seemingly inexhaustible financial resources. The daily costs of his existence were staggering, defying logical comprehension. He required massive, steadily increasing daily quantities of morphine and cocaine just to function, purchasing the highest quality narcotics available through a shadowy network of high-end dealers. But the drugs were only a fraction of the expense. He maintained a constantly rotating, highly paid entourage of sailors, petty criminals, and male prostitutes. He funded their lives entirely, purchasing their silence, their absolute loyalty, and their enthusiastic participation in his endless, grueling orgies. He rented lavish apartments solely for the purpose of destroying them in days-long narcotic binges. He treated Marie's fortune not as a shared marital asset, but as an open, bottomless vault, to which he had been granted exclusive access. When his exorbitant daily spending rapidly exhausted their ready cash reserves, he did not slow down. He simply shifted his focus to the systematic liquidation of her life's work. He began to bleed her assets piece by piece. He aggressively forced the sale of her vast, carefully managed portfolio of stocks and bonds. When that money vanished into the veins of his arms and the pockets of the Parisian underworld, he turned to her personal history. He took her magnificent historic jewelry, the diamond tiaras, the heavy emerald necklaces, the priceless pieces that had defined her absolute social dominance for decades, and quietly handed them over to pawnbrokers to feed his dealers. The bleeding of her wealth was relentless, systematic, and executed with a terrifying, unfeeling speed. He was a black hole, consuming decades of generational wealth in a matter of months. Marie, once a woman of formidable power and influence, was reduced to a helpless bystander in her own ruin, entirely incapable of stopping the monster she had legally invited into her home. The ultimate crushing blow, the moment that truly signified the absolute destruction of her legacy, arrived in 1938. Luis Fernando had accumulated debts so astronomically high in just 8 years of marriage that there was only one asset left large enough to satisfy his creditors. Marie was forced to surrender the crown jewel of her existence. The Château de Chaumont-sur-Loire, the majestic historic estate she had lovingly restored, fiercely protected, and presided over for more than half a century, was sold off to the French state. It was a profound, deeply humiliating, and entirely public defeat. Luis Fernando had taken a woman who was once a towering titan of European high society and methodically stripped her of everything. He took her home, her generational wealth, her family legacy, and her fundamental dignity, reducing it all to ashes simply to sustain a chemical high and to buy the hollow transactional adoration of the Parisian gutter. He had finally achieved total ruin, dragging an innocent woman down into the dark, suffocating depths of his own personal hell. The severing of the Château de Chaumont-sur-Loire from Marie-Say's possession in 1938 was not merely a real estate transaction. It was the brutal public amputation of her identity. For over half a century, that sprawling Renaissance fortress had been the undeniable physical manifestation of her power, her generational wealth, and her untouchable status at the absolute pinnacle of European society. When the massive iron gates closed behind her for the final time, sold off to the French state to satisfy the bottomless debts of a drug-addicted exile, the 81-year-old dowager was entirely stripped of her armor. The grand illusion she had so desperately clung to, the fiction that she was a beloved royal wife protecting a misunderstood prince, shattered completely. She was forced to confront the terrifying, suffocating reality that the man she had married was not a victim of a cruel dynasty, but a ruthless architect of her personal annihilation. She had traded her empire, her dignity, and her final years of peace for the privilege of watching a disgraced Bourbon slowly kill himself with her money. This catastrophic financial ruin coincided with a far more terrifying global collapse. The vibrant, chaotic, and relentlessly forgiving Paris that Luis Fernando had conquered in the 1920s was already dying, suffocated by the creeping dread of the late 1930s. The manic jazz, the endless flow of champagne, and the absolute sexual liberation of the Années Folles evaporated as the shadow of fascism stretched across Europe. By the summer of 1940, the nightmare materialized. The jackboots of the German Wehrmacht marched down the Champs-Élysées, and the swastika was violently raised over the Eiffel Tower. The city of light went entirely dark. For a man like Luis Fernando, the Nazi occupation of Paris should have been an immediate death sentence. The Gestapo and the occupying authorities ruthlessly hunted down the very people who had populated his underground kingdom. Homosexuals, drug addicts, bohemian artists, and the petty criminals of Montmartre were systematically swept up, imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps. The shadowy neon-lit dives where he had once held court as the king of Sodom were raided and boarded up. The rent boys and sailors who had previously flocked to his lavish, drug-fueled orgies either fled the city, went deep into hiding, or were conscripted into forced labor. The ecosystem of debauchery that had sustained him for 2 decades was eradicated overnight by a regime of terrifying mechanized brutality. Yet Luis Fernando survived the initial purges. He was no longer the flamboyant, diamond-draped provocateur wandering the streets in heavy theatrical makeup. He was, by the early 1940s, a severely diminished figure, his body so entirely ravaged by decades of relentless morphine and cocaine abuse that he barely resembled the handsome Infante of his youth. Furthermore, despite his absolute poverty and his excommunication from the Spanish court, the name Orleans y Bourbon still carried a faint, residual diplomatic weight. The occupying forces, entangled in complex political maneuvering with the officially neutral but fascist-leaning regime of Francisco Franco in Spain, likely saw no tactical advantage in executing a disgraced, dying relative of the Spanish monarchy. They simply ignored him, leaving him to rot in the squalor he had created for himself. He and Marise were forced to abandon the sprawling luxury they had once known, retreating into a cramped, claustrophobic Parisian apartment. The stark contrast between this bleak reality and the gilded palaces of his youth in Madrid, or even the majestic halls of the Chateau de Chaumont, was absolute. They were entirely isolated in a terrified, starving city. The immense fortune of the Say Sugar Empire was gone, liquidated, and injected into Luis Fernando's veins. The daily reality of their existence became a grueling, humiliating struggle for basic survival. For a severe addict in an occupied, war-torn city, the situation was catastrophic. The high-end, pure narcotics that Luis Fernando had previously purchased with ease were suddenly scarce, exorbitant, and incredibly dangerous to procure. The illicit supply lines were severed or strictly controlled by the occupying forces and a ruthless black market. He was frequently forced into agonizing, involuntary periods of withdrawal, his already failing body racked by violent tremors, fever, and the sheer, unfiltered terror of facing reality without a chemical shield. He was trapped in a small space with an increasingly frail, impoverished woman whose life he had systematically destroyed, surrounded by a city patrolled by armed fascists who actively despised his existence. In 1943, the long, excruciating agony of Marie Constance Charlotte Say finally came to an end. She died in their modest apartment at the age of 86. Her passing was not marked by the grand state-level mourning that would have accompanied her death a decade earlier. There were no European monarchs sending condolences, no grand processions through the streets of Paris. She died quietly, in reduced circumstances, her vast legacy entirely dismantled. It was a profoundly tragic, lonely end for a woman who had once commanded one of the greatest fortunes in France. She died having witnessed the absolute evaporation of her life's work, leaving the world with nothing but the bitter knowledge of her own colossal misjudgment. With her death, Luis Fernando was plunged into an entirely new depth of isolation. He was 55 years old, but his internal organs and his physical appearance belonged to a man decades older. He was a widower, utterly destitute, and entirely alone in a city that was slowly starving under the grip of the Gestapo. He had no entourage, no loyal courtiers, and no sycophants left to purchase. The young men who had once worshipped him had vanished, and the high society enablers who had once found his rebellion amusing had long since fled the country or abandoned him to his fate. If there was ever a moment for the Spanish royal family to intervene, to show a shred of Christian charity or dynastic solidarity, this was it. The Spanish monarchy had endured its own catastrophic upheaval. King Alfonso XIII, the man who had violently stripped Luis Fernando of his titles and banished him from his homeland, had been forced into exile himself when the Second Spanish Republic was declared in 1931. Alfonso spent his final years wandering Europe, ultimately dying in Rome in 1941. One might assume that this shared experience of exile, the mutual loss of their homeland, might have softened the royal family's stance toward their disgraced cousin. It did not. The boundaries erected by the Bourbon dynasty remained fiercely, unyieldingly intact. Even with the primary architect of his banishment dead, the surviving members of the Spanish royal family maintained a wall of absolute silence. They offered no financial assistance, sent no emissaries to check on his well-being, and offered no pathway to reconciliation. To the Bourbon, Infante Luis Fernando was still legally and spiritually dead. He was a terrifying reminder of the fragility of royal dignity, a living, breathing scandal that they refused to acknowledge. They left him in occupied Paris to face the consequences of his life entirely alone, effectively washing their hands of his existence as he entered his final, agonizing descent. Unable to care for himself, lacking the funds to secure private medical attention, and physically collapsing under the compounded weight of malnutrition and decades of severe chemical dependency, Luis Fernando was eventually moved to a nursing home, a clinical austere facility in Paris. This was the ultimate crushing defeat for a man who had spent his entire adult life aggressively fighting against confinement. He had violently rejected the golden cage of the Madrid palaces, tearing his own life apart to secure the absolute, lawless freedom of the Parisian underground. He had sacrificed his family, his titles, and his wife's fortune simply to ensure that no one could ever dictate his actions. Now he was entirely stripped of his autonomy. He was confined to a narrow hospital bed, subject to the rigid, sterile routines of wartime nurses and orderlies who cared nothing for his lineage or his past infamy. The prince of the underworld, the man who had commanded rooms with heavy diamonds and a glare sharpened by cocaine, was reduced to a frail, highly dependent patient waiting for the inevitable end. He lay in that stark room for 2 long years as the war raged outside his window. He was a living ghost, a relic of 2 entirely dead eras. He belonged neither to the rigid, absolute monarchies of the 19th century that had birthed him, nor to the manic, glittering decadence of the 1920s that had briefly crowned him. As the Allied forces slowly battered their way across Europe, and the distant dream of Parisian liberation began to take shape in the summer of 1944, Luis Fernando remained trapped in his own decaying flesh. His body, systematically poisoned over 20 years, was finally shutting down. The Grand Rebellion had run its course, leaving behind nothing but an exhausted, hollowed-out man staring at the ceiling of a clinic, waiting for the final curtain to fall on a life defined by spectacular, self-inflicted ruin. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a seismic, euphoric explosion of human joy. After 4 years of suffocating Nazi occupation, the streets of the French capital suddenly filled with the deafening roar of Allied tanks, the frantic ringing of church bells, and the ecstatic cheers of millions of citizens reclaiming their city. The swastikas were violently torn down, replaced by the tricolor flag fluttering triumphantly from the Eiffel Tower. The city of light, which had been plunged into a terrified darkness, was violently, beautifully resurrected. But inside the austere, unyielding walls of a Parisian nursing home, this historic resurrection meant absolutely nothing. The frantic celebrations echoing down the boulevards did not penetrate the quiet, sterile room where Luis Fernando de Orleans y Bourbon lay dying. The world outside his window was entirely focused on the future, on rebuilding a shattered continent. Inside his room, there was only the agonizing, drawn-out conclusion of a man who had successfully destroyed his own future decades ago. He was trapped. The man who had once treated the entire continent of Europe as his personal lawless playground, crossing borders in drag and commanding the darkest corners of the Parisian underground, was now entirely confined to a narrow metal bed. His physical deterioration was absolute. The severe, relentless abuse of cocaine and morphine, combined with the extreme deprivations of the wartime occupation, had entirely hollowed him out. At 56 years old, he possessed the ravaged, skeletal frame of a man far older. His internal organs were failing systematically, unable to process the decades of chemical toxicity he had forced upon them. The grand, chaotic rebellion that had defined his existence was reduced to a slow, humiliating surrender to his own failing biology. Even as the war in Europe officially ended in May 1945, bringing an end to the global slaughter and reopening the borders of the continent, the absolute isolation of the former Infante remained unbroken. The Spanish royal family, now scattered across Europe in their own respective exiles, following the collapse of the monarchy in 1931, were acutely aware of his location and his terminal condition. Yet the wall of silence they had constructed around him decades earlier held firm. There were no frantic telegrams of reconciliation. There were no quiet, discreet visits from emissaries carrying messages of familial forgiveness. To the Bourbon dynasty, forgiving Luis Fernando even on his deathbed meant acknowledging his existence. It meant admitting that the rigid, perfect facade of royal blood could produce a man who actively desired the company of male prostitutes over foreign princesses, a man who preferred the agonizing grip of narcotics to the sacred duties of the crown. The monarchy, even in its exiled, fractured state, demanded absolute conformity to its illusions. Because Luis Fernando had publicly, violently shattered those illusions, he was left to die exactly as they had decreed him to be, entirely erased from the family tree. On June 20th, 1945, the long, agonizing spectacle finally concluded. Luis Fernando, Maria Zacarias de Orleans y Bourbon drew his last breath in a lonely hospital room. There were no royal physicians desperately attempting to revive him, no courtiers waiting outside the door to announce the passing of a prince, and no family members holding his hands. The official medical records listed the cause of death with a polite bureaucratic euphemism, noting a long illness. But the undeniable reality was that he died of a profound self-inflicted exhaustion. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively burning his candle from both ends, utilizing unparalleled wealth to fuel a relentless chemical escape from the reality of his own birthright. When the money vanished and the drugs ran out, his body simply had nothing left to consume but itself. The immediate aftermath of his death provided the starkest, most devastating contrast to the circumstances of his birth. When a Spanish infante dies, the protocol is ancient, massive, and immovable. The passing is meant to be marked by a period of national mourning. Grand, soaring requiem masses are held in the sprawling cathedrals of Madrid, the air thick with incense and the solemn chanting of high-ranking clergy. The body is traditionally destined for the royal crypt of the monastery of El Escorial, a colossal, intimidating architectural marvel where the remains of Spanish monarchs and princes rest in rotting chambers before being placed in permanent gilded marble pantheons. It is a death designed to reinforce the absolute eternal power of the dynasty. Luis Fernando received none of this. The Spanish state did not acknowledge his passing, and the Bourbon family issued no public statements. His remains were not transported back to the Iberian Peninsula, the homeland that had legally barred him from entering for over 20 years. Instead, his funeral took place in Paris, at the Église du Cœur Immaculé de Marie. It was a modest, entirely ordinary parish church, completely devoid of the soaring, terrifying grandeur of El Escorial. It is here, at this quiet Parisian funeral, that the entire narrative of Luis Fernando's life demands a profound re-evaluation. If you want to measure the true legacy of a man, you look at who stands by his grave when there is absolutely nothing left to gain from him. The pews of the church were entirely empty of aristocratic blood. The glittering high society figures who had once eagerly attended his lavish, scandalous parties in the 1920s did not show up. The wealthy expatriates who had previously clamored for an invitation to his salons were completely absent. Instead, the mourners who gathered to watch the casket of the former Infante be lowered into the earth consisted of a small, quiet handful of aging men. These were the battered survivors of the Parisian underground, the remnants of the kingdom he had built in the shadows. They were former sailors whose youth had faded, aging street hustlers, and the rent boys who had once populated his notorious drug-fueled orgies. These were men who existed on the absolute jagged fringes of society, individuals who had been criminalized, hunted by the Gestapo, and despised by the respectable world. They had nothing to offer him now, no money, no status, no royal pardons, yet they were the only ones who showed up to honor his passing. This stark, heartbreaking image forces a total recalibration of how we view the Prince of Black Roses. Up until this final moment, it is incredibly easy to dismiss him merely as a villainous, wildly destructive degenerate. We have witnessed his staggering selfishness. We have documented the ruthless, predatory manner in which he hunted down an elderly woman, marrying Marise solely to hijack her colossal fortune. We have seen him methodically liquidate her generational wealth, forcing the sale of her historic chateau, and driving her into an impoverished, humiliated death, all to feed his insatiable appetite for cocaine and the adoration of the gutter. His capacity for destruction was immense, and the wreckage he left behind was entirely real. But the presence of those outcast men at his funeral reveals the terrifying, tragic complexity of his existence. Luis Fernando was not merely a monster. He was a casualty in a brutal, uncompromising war between his fundamental nature and the crushing expectations of his bloodline. He was born into an institution that did not just demand his obedience. It demanded the total lifelong erasure of his authentic self. The Spanish monarchy required him to live a lie, to marry a woman he could never desire, and to present a facade of martial heterosexual perfection to a society that would have violently destroyed him had they known the truth. Faced with the prospect of living a heavily decorated, spiritually dead existence in a gilded cage, Luis Fernando chose to detonate his life. He chose the drugs, the public scandals, and the violent descent into the criminal underworld, because it was the only space where he was permitted to exist without apologies. The tragic reality of the 1920s was that an unapologetic, openly homosexual man had no place in the bright light of respectable society, least of all within a royal court. To be free, he had to embrace the darkness. He had to become the king of Sodom because the legitimate kingdoms of the earth actively rejected his humanity. He weaponized his wealth and his title to carve out an empire in the shadows, creating a sanctuary where he could command respect, however transactional, on his own terms. The cost of this absolute freedom was astronomical. It cost him his family, his homeland, his immense privilege, the life of his wife, and ultimately his own physical survival. It was a terrifying, deeply destructive bargain. But as he lay in that hospital bed, entirely abandoned by the Bourbons, but remembered by the outcasts of Montmartre, one must ask, did he regret it? Did he miss the suffocating corridors of the Madrid palaces? Or did he value the manic, unapologetic truth of his Parisian nights more than any crown he could have inherited? He chose a life of spectacular ruin over a life of quiet suffocation. He was an active participant in his own tragedy, a man who burned his world to the ground simply to feel the warmth of the fire. The Spanish monarchy succeeded in stripping him of his titles, but they could never strip him of the defiance that defined his existence. When the New York Times published his obituary a few days later, on June 23, 1945, the headline was a masterpiece of cold, dismissive understatement. It read, simply, "Prince figured in scandals." In those 4 words, the establishment attempted to summarize and dismiss an entire lifetime of profound, agonizing conflict. They reduced a man who had gone to war against his own destiny to a mere footnote of bad behavior. The story of Infante Luis Fernando is a terrifying testament to the absolute limits of privilege and the devastating price of authenticity in a world built on rigid conformity. It proves that a royal title cannot act as a shield against the crushing weight of personal despair, nor can immense wealth purchase an escape from the fundamental truth of who you are. His life highlights the violent, glaring contradictions of the human experience. How a man can be born with everything and deliberately choose nothing. How a prince can find more loyalty among prostitutes than among kings. And how the pursuit of living one's truth can sometimes look exactly like self-annihilation. He remains the ultimate black sheep of the Bourbon dynasty, a terrifying specter that royal historians spent decades actively trying to erase. He is the ultimate cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of power, a reminder of how quickly a dynasty can rot from the inside out when the demands of the institution clash with the undeniable realities of human desire. But beneath the scandal, the drugs, and the financial ruin, there lies the fragile, enduring beauty of a man who categorically refused to be tamed. He accepted the absolute destruction of his public self rather than live a lie, securing a deeply flawed, ugly freedom that was entirely his own. But the intoxicating, poisonous allure of Parisian decadence was not exclusively fatal to Luis Fernando. The Bourbon bloodline harbored other fractures, other figures who found the weight of the crown entirely unbearable, and sought refuge in the chaotic oblivion of the French capital. There was another Spanish royal, another prince who plunged headfirst into the same dark, drug-fueled underworld, actively mirroring the very destruction that had claimed his infamous relative. He too was seduced by the narcotics, consumed by the illicit nightlife, and eventually faced the brutal, unyielding wrath of a family desperate to protect its name. Who was this second prince? And how did his own descent into the Parisian shadows threaten to unravel the very fabric of the monarchy once again? You can probably guess exactly who he was.